Welcome back, everyone. You know the setup, the live chat. You can put questions there if we have an opportunity. Maybe I'll bring questions forward, but for the most part, I'm going to turn my camera off and not be part of this. And we have one of our committee members, Carla-Jean. She is going to moderate this discussion, and we have our three wonderful judges are going to now become panelists for this discussion. So Carla-Jean, I'm going to slip out of the way and let you take over.
All right, thanks so much, Tom. Good morning to everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm here from beautiful British Columbia, where we just got some snow last night. And you may or may not hear my toddler in the background. So if you do, just have a good giggle, because obviously your day is going better than mine. And so I'm here with our three panelists who just judged our 3-minute thesis competition, if you missed that. So I will just reintroduce them very, very briefly so that we can get the ball rolling. So I'm here with Tanya, Graham, and Renee. They're all historians and professors of history in Canada. And what we're going to talk about today is studying, researching military history. And what the heck is this field, and where is it going, and all of that. So actually, I'm going to throw Tanya on the hot seat first and ask. I have my notes right in front of me, so I'm like looking down. Here we go. We see different definitions of what constitutes military history. We see them thrown around a lot, particularly online. That's sort of my barometer for everything, is what I see on social media. And a lot of people like to argue, what is military history? So I'm going to ask Tanya first if she can give us a definition of what that means to her.
Okay, thank you. An English friend of mine once defined military history as being maps and chaps, meaning it's all about battle. And for many, military history is about the kinetic aspect of military operations, the force on force, if you will. The real daring examine things like logistics, which is a topic most people choose to ignore. There's a lot of interest in leadership, but given the significance of military history, I think Winston Churchill stated military history is the punctuation of the words of history. And the size of armies and how they've evolved and so forth, the people that comprise them, whether they're Europeans, indigenous peoples, colonial subjects, if you will, and then adding women and then social dimensions within those groups. I'm really pleased that this whole area is expanding. So, rather than dealing with strategy, operational art, tactical questions, and so forth, we're looking into the social aspects of military, the relationships between military encampments and communities. There's a growing literature about LGBTQ plus communities within armies, navies, and air forces. And there's some marvelous work coming out of the UK and Australia on that. So I think it encompasses so many things rather than just the traditional. I guess what sells is the traditional type of thing where we want to find out about fighting. And given how much military topics have been in the public eye, most recently the events of the last few days, I think that draws people. So you see it in popular documentaries, more serious documentaries, podcasts, and so forth. But people are also interested in what soldiers, sailors, and air personnel did, what happened behind the front, what about diseases that they encountered, food that they had. What is this whole thing about military discipline and all these topics? So I'm glad to see that people are examining it from a far different perspective and not just looking at it from a traditional view.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. So Renee, I want to ask you next how you might define it or how you might react to Tanya's definition of it. And additionally, how do you find yourself within that definition?
I agree very much with everything that Tanya said. Certainly when I was a student, military history, that phrase didn't sit well with me. It sounded like a really boring game of Risk with like that lasted 8 months with stale snacks and flat beer or something like that, like just nothing that I was particularly interested in. And so the way that I came into studying, I guess, military history was through my teaching. And so I came into it through a different sort of avenue than my studies. And so the phrase itself, that term, the idea of that as a discipline, doesn't have a clear meaning for me as in the way that I think about what I do. I find it in some ways unhelpful for a description of what it is that I do. And in part, that's because of what Tanya was hinting at, is that the military things that I study are not separate from civilian things. The war times, I don't see them as being separate from the peace times. I think that I think it was Roger Cooter. I'm not entirely positive, but I think it was Roger Cooter who said that war and military things they're economically, they're ideologically, they're socially constitutive of the societies that they happen in. And so I find it unhelpful to use the phrase military history, because I see it as something that the more we look at it, the more we tell stories that are different from what happens around that risk game, it becomes something quite different. And it says a lot more, and it can say a lot more about who we are. And it can make it, easier to look at things obviously it's very comfortable to look at what's been happening in the past couple of days, but it certainly is something that it's not separate from anything else. So I actually find the phrase, to repeat myself, I find it actually a little bit unhelpful. I find it limiting to think of myself as a military historian. I normally don't describe myself as a military historian. So that's sort of how I would react, my gut reaction to that question. I think military history is a limiting term.
All right, thank you so much, Renee. You guys are giving me so much to think about, but it's not about me. So we're going to move to Graham and hear from him. Graham, how do you react to that? And do you think you're a military historian?
It may be a bit boring and agree with both my colleagues. Whenever I meet normal people and they ask what I do for a living, and I tell them I'm a historian, it kind of stops them in their tracks, right? Like it never even occurred to them this is something that one could do. And so they pause and I say, oh, I'm a history professor. And say, oh, okay, that I understand. That's a job category that exists, right? Historian isn't. And then maybe about half the time, they'll try to extricate themselves from that conversation. And the other half of the time, they'll say, oh, what type of history you do? And if I'm dealing with someone who's not a historian, I kind of use military history as a shorthand. I'll say I'm a military historian because again, they can kind of conjure with that. But I think I'd agree with Renee in the sense that I don't really conceive of myself as a military historian in the standard sense of the word, and that I don't really study military operations, for example. I don't study grand strategy or leadership in times of or military leadership in times of war that I would define as being maybe hard military history, sometimes called operational military history. Now having said that, I might call my field war and society studies. It's sometimes referred to as where we take what we're interested in militarily and we situate it in a broader context of social and cultural history, or the reverse. We take what we're interested in terms of society and culture and situate it in times of war to see how those things, the complex interplay of those things. So I guess, yeah, I mean, it's if you press me for definitions, that's how I would define myself. But one thing I would note is that this is a very old discussion within the field of military history. And even what I just called war and society studies, that's not new. I mean, that term first emerged in the early 1970s. And the basic idea has been around for well over half a century. So this isn't some kind of newfangled academic approach that we cooked up in the last 10 years. There's been work being done in this field for a long time now.
Graham, it's like you read my mind, because you really did a beautiful job of introducing my next question. So we're gonna pop it right back to Renee, actually. And I want to ask all of you, but we'll start with Renee. With these definitions in mind, where is this field going, do you think? And what are some of the biggest issues that, if we're thinking about that hard military history, the operational history, is it facing issues in Canada? I guess Graham's talked about how it's the war in society has emerged for decades. But anyway, so let me re-ask you. With those definitions in mind, where do we see this field going? And what are some of the biggest issues that operational military history might be facing in Canada right now in the academy?
Well, I think that whether you're talking about the study of war in society or operational studies, it is expanding in so many incredibly exciting ways. Tanya touched on a number of them. My most recent reading has been the environmental impacts of war and battle, which I think is an incredibly exciting area. In terms of the challenges, I think that there is, I come up against, I guess, what I would call a lot of inertia and a lot of resistance to the idea that military history, about what it is and the way that I do it. And I guess the easiest way that I can explain that is the profound disappointment that at least every year, a large section of my big first year classes have when I get to talking about World War I, and I spend more time talking about venereal disease, plastic surgery, and bread rationing than I do, what's going on at the front and who is moving where. So I think they want Call of Duty, and I'm giving them Enchanted April or something. So there seems to be in some ways a disconnect between I'll just sort of back out of that a little bit and say that certainly I would never say that operational histories are bad. I read them all the time. I think they're incredibly valuable for giving light and depth and texture to what I do. So I think they're incredibly valuable. I think my frustration is that I find that people who are embedded in operational histories, not all the time, but some of them, certainly among students that I've had, they don't see the value in looking in the other direction. That's at least one challenge that I see, is sort of bridging that particular gap. I don't know what Tanya and Graham have come across, but certainly I get lots of comments on my student evaluations at the end of the year that say things like, more guns and stop talking about women. It's a little frustrating.
I can see why that would be extremely frustrating. I want to take it back to Tanya, obviously, because you've been working at Royal Military College, I think, for quite some time. And I think that I just want to leave it to you. I don't want to actually put any of my views into this. How do you react to that with your own experience of the school that you've worked at?
Okay. Because I'm no longer in uniform, I can say certain things that I couldn't before. And it's nothing scandalous or anything, but some aspects of the program I thought were superb. Because one of the challenges is finding places in Canada to study military history. Terry Kopp built up, I think, what was the only real school of military history in Canada, and he's slowly bowing out. The military college has a great focus on military diplomatic history, focused principally on the 20th century, largely land-oriented, and has a tendency to offer courses on strategy that are actually talking about tactics. So there's some excellent work within various fields. There's one faculty member there who's examining Canadian battles in Normandy, but from the German perspective, which is very welcome. So, a very fresh look at that. But there's other areas, like my own field was the War of 1812, which I think will make Renee happy. And when I was doing my doctorate, I basically made up the courses and found the faculty to guide me through them, as opposed to, going the other way around. And so it's very focused. And this is true in other institutions. What is Canadian military history? Is it end or begin in 1867? How do we view the colonial period? And we're re-examining this with Truth and Reconciliation as well, taking very different perspectives on this, people of color, and so forth. So it's wonderful to see this expansion, but I see too many students being drawn into traditional areas. Like it's wonderful that people are debating what happened in Normandy in the summer of 1944, but quite frankly, it's getting into nanohistory. And we need to examine so many other topics because there's so many gaps within that. So it's a question of availability of centers of study, concentration on really 20th century conflict, in particular the two world wars. But there's some exciting stuff. I've been approached by a student to supervise them through their doctoral dissertation, and they want to look at environmental aspects of the War of 1812, which I think is really awesome. So there, it's like any field of study. There's some great stuff. It's ossified in certain areas, and other areas it's going into bold new territory. Thank you.
So sorry, Tanya, just to follow up with you on that, do you think that expanding how we view military history a lot more along the lines of what you first defined it as is how the historiography is going to stay fresh and how we're going to fill in those gaps, I think is what you're saying?
Well, yeah, partly because really this is a human interaction. And so you want to study human psychology, human motivation, and so forth. So it's one thing to focus in on what happened in the action, but let's take a look at the social background of the leaders who were there, the soldiers, where they came from. How do you take somebody from civilian life and turn them into a sergeant major? I used to say that grade school children or grade school teachers would make the most marvelous sergeants major in the Army because they know how to move groups of people around. But this is the whole thing. So if we understand the people, then we can see what happens in the field and how potentially they react under the stress of combat, or my God, sitting in England for 4 years before you're engaged in any action whatsoever. So this, and it also breaks down stereotypes. And I mentioned, for example, some of the studies of gay soldiers in the First World War coming out of the UK and Australia. It completely changes your perspective on interaction in this period and the perceptions of other soldiers that you would tend to think would want to take a pistol to these individuals, and that's not necessarily the case. So it's a very interesting insight into the periods.
Great, thank you so much. Graham, I want to now ask you that same question. Where is the field going? Tanya made reference to the former LCMSDS, which is now the Laurier Center for the Study of Canada, so it's shifted its mandate. Do you see similar things happening with other military study centers? What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak about academe in Canada, and the challenge that we face in the field of military history broadly defined is one faced by history departments generally, which is that we're facing declining enrollments. Most history programs across the country have about half as many enrollments now as we did 10 years ago. Provincial funding models are changing so that universities are simply getting less money per domestic student than in the past, which means we're more heavily reliant upon foreign students for our revenue stream. At some universities, it's not uncommon now that international student fees are more than 50% of their tuition revenue. And so consequently, history as a discipline simply in decline, and departments that are under-resourced don't get new hires. As anybody's in the PhD market right now, PhD history job market right now knows, right? And so the consequence of that is departments have to prioritize their hires, the few hires that they get. And right now, military history just isn't a priority for departments, for most departments across the country. The priorities right now are, and rightly, by the way, indigenization, decolonization, EDI, which is for people unfamiliar with equity, diversity, and inclusion, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily exclude military history, but because someone could work in those fields, but do war and society studies, for example, but it would be coincident to those goals. And so what does this mean? It means as there's fewer military historians within the academy doing research, increasingly military history is going to become the domain of non-academic historians. And it's one field that's very curious in that there is a large non-academic body of people producing military history. You don't get this with gender history. You don't get this with early Christian art history. et cetera, right? But you do get it with military history. And some of them do it very, very well, but make no mistake, that popular publishing market is entirely revenue driven, which means what publishers are going to want is mainly stuff about military operations, because there will always be room for another book about D-Day, another coffee table book about tanks or what have you. Malcolm Gladwell just wrote a book about the bomber campaign during the Second World War, sold hundreds of thousands of copies. But say work on the gendered implications of household management in times of war, or some of the other topics we've been talking about today, which happen to be very important from a scholarly point of view, those types of things just don't fly with trade publishers, right? So the discipline's in for some hard days ahead, and I don't know what the solution is. The only solution is people have to pressure governments to give universities their funding back.
Great. Graham, I want to follow up with you, sort of. This isn't a follow-up, we're moving on, but it's all related. So I want to ask you about a tweet that you sent out earlier last year. You commented on a picture of an event that's called Warfest that's held in the UK. And you noted that the audience was predominantly white and male.
Yeah.
Can you tell us, why did you want to post that tweet, and what was the backlash that you received?
So a couple of things. One is, for anybody who wants to go looking, I deactivated my Twitter account over the weekend. 2 years of hearing everybody with an opinion become an expert epidemiologist I'd reached the breaking point, but then suddenly everybody became an expert on Eastern Europe, and I couldn't take it anymore. So I deactivated my account. I was spending more time reading amateur hot takes on the news than actually reading the news. So I deactivated for now. Yeah, look, there was this thing called Warfest, and it's run by some podcasters in the UK who are apparently quite good. But I felt the name in itself bothered me. Look, there's a place for dark humor in the study of war. The soldiers themselves had it. It's something we can study. But when we talk about war, there should be a degree of decorum. I felt that name was inappropriate. And then there's this giant photograph of 600 people who looked exactly like me, sort of mirror universe versions of Graham, filling a room. So I just tweeted it and said, maybe we need to talk about this. Maybe we need to talk about representation issues in this discipline. What was interesting about the response was that a large number of historians came forward and said, yeah, that's my experience. We do need to talk about this, women, people of color. But there was a kind of backlash against all of them from people who, in my opinion, exactly proved my point. And it got quite ugly. I actually got a couple of threats over direct messaging. I work at King's College in London, Ontario. I think a bunch of people in the UK thought I worked at King's College London and London, England. And they threatened to come down there and have a go at me. So I actually offered to meet them at Charing Cross Station. I don't know if they ever showed up or not, but at any rate, yeah, it was an unfortunate event, but I wish at least, people, their initial response wouldn't be to push back. Their initial response would maybe be to say, okay, let's hear what people have to say. Let's actually think about this issue of representation as possibly being a problem.
Great, thanks so much. So Renee and Tanya, I want to ask you about that too. This maybe there is a demographic issue, perhaps related to ethnicity or race, perhaps related to gender identity, and perhaps is related to age too. I don't know. So if you want to react to that, that's great. So if the field of military history is predominantly peopled by those demographics, how do we begin to engage other demographics? And then there's a question in the chat right now that I'm just going to bring in as well, where Ewan wants to know our thoughts on decolonizing military history, and perhaps that could go hand in hand with this. Why don't we start with Renee and then we'll go to Tanya.
I find the reaction, and I follow those reactions to your tweet, Graham, and it was the level of investment that some people have in this version of military history, that it must be, and that it is, about manly men doing manly things, and that anybody who doesn't look like Graham or some version of Graham can't be part of that is something that I find really profoundly disturbing. But it's also something that has dogged me a little bit. When I was a very junior scholar, one of the very first public presentations I ever gave was about drunkenness and misbehavior among soldiers in the War of 1812, and it was at a military build. I can't remember the name of the place. The armory. Sorry, it was at an armory. And at the end of my talk, I was asked a public question by a former veteran who was also one of those amateur historians. And he didn't ask me a question. He basically accused me of besmirching the memories of these men. And I can't remember how I reacted. He followed that up with a comment about how young women should find more appropriate things to study. And I can't remember how I answered. I think in my memory, I was like an Amazon warrior, and there was applause and cheering when I finished. But I think I stumbled through some kind of answer that that said something like, if drinking was important to the men at the time, why should it not be important to us now? And if we want to understand them and what they did, we have to understand that part of their lives. It was a kind of a weak answer, but it speaks to, I think, one of the things that I think we can potentially do to change the approach and the attitude and that investment in this vision of military history. And that is to keep telling these stories that are uncomfortable for those people, to tell the stories about gay soldiers, to tell the stories about Indigenous warriors and Black battalions and people of color and women, because I think the only way to, I guess, normalize it is to constantly have that conversation and to persistently point out that this vision of heroic, sublime warriors is not at all accurate, that it's not at all reflective of who they were, and in many cases it's not reflective of who they thought they themselves were or who they wanted to be. So I think for me professionally as an historian, I consider my job to tell uncomfortable stories, to make people uncomfortable, and to kind of shift them off of their center if I can do it. So, but it's the investment in that vision is really, really upsetting to me, always upsetting to me.
And Tanya, I'd love to hear from you as well.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really competing with what people think history was with what we, through study, as we're approaching what would be called truth, it actually was, or at least the level of our research defines it as. And it's a constant struggle within those areas. And I find because it's largely dominated by white men, breaking into that mold is difficult. I remember being at one conference where they were introducing people and they said, well, this is Dr. Smith, this is Dr. Jones, this is Tanya. And I said, whoa. Excuse me, I have a PhD. I did all that study. I spent years in school doing this. I have several books published. And they went, yeah, that's very nice. Could you please be quiet? And I would often get cut off when I was answering questions. So breaking into that mold, and then once people accept that is an important thing. But the experience I had at the military college too was dealing with other dynamics, because we also have a Francophone population at the college. So and Francophone scholars, French Canadian scholars, view military history in a far broader area than I would say English Canadians do. English Canadians focus on what I call the kinetic operations. French Canadians, they're more than receptive to the social, war and society types of things. And then on top of that, there's a program where Indigenous students come in for a year. So that's forced a re-examination of the Indigenous role in history. So for example, I used to give walking tours of the campus to first-year students, and I suddenly found myself with 12 Indigenous students in front of me, recasting that and questioning the way I had presented that before. So the student population changes that as well. And as you see the various diaspora come in, you might be surprised to learn that the third most spoken language on the campus I'm at is Korean. And so they have a different perspective, and different cultural groups bring different perspectives on the military, not all of which view it as an honorable career, because they come from cultures where the military was used against them. But getting back to the basic question, I think this is something that is apparent almost everywhere I go. You're beginning to see women scholars have greater influence. And I think what helps it is the success of certain scholars, that break these molds and they become the keynote speakers. And people are much more willing. I remember when Margaret McMillan came to RMC to speak, that was a huge event. And seeing a woman giving an address to the college was very important. And it's true in other environments. So I don't know if that answers anything, but.
That's my constant worry, is that I don't know if I've answered anything. It's fine. So Renee sort of touched on this, like how we can engage other demographics is to do what we do, focus on the work, tell those uncomfortable stories, and that can bring about change. I want to also have sort of Graham and Tanya touch on that too. I'd like to follow up. What do you think would be the result when we more successfully realign that gender or ethnic or racial or age balance? What else will come out of that, do you think? Oh, sorry, let's start with Graham. Let's go to Tanya after that. And then Renee, if you want to jump in as well and add any more thoughts.
I want to proceed with some caution here because, as the sort of archetype of the white male tenured professor, right, with privilege, and I want to be careful about what I mean by privilege. I mean, I work really hard and it's often been a struggle and so forth, but the difference is that I'm massively compensated for my hard work and struggle, right? And that's not always the case for others. And that's being in a very privileged position. I want to be careful in that I wish to speak as an ally to these causes, but at the same time, I'm equally entreated that it's very important to just listen at times, right? But I guess I would just make the following a couple of observations that sometimes these discussions are dismissed in our contemporary cultural environment as wokeness, right? It's just all wokeness. It's just a kind of shorthand dismissal that 20 years ago, people would have said politically correct, right? It's exactly the same cultural acts that they're grinding. But just, and maybe for those of you who feel that way, maybe people are listening and who feel that way, I just urge you for a second to put all that aside and ask yourself, is it actually good history to write a history of the Pacific War that doesn't consider China? Is it actually good history to write a history of the atomic bombing of Japan that doesn't look seriously at Japanese decision-making? Because we literally have decades of historiography that's done exactly that. There are whole histories of the Pacific War that are just stories of American carrier battles and American island hopping campaigns that give no consideration to the indigenous populations of the islands that were fought on, of the regions of the world that were fought on. Some of them places that are vastly populous, right? Like the Philippines, for example. Another example, it's only been in the last 20 years that we've seen serious scholarship in English about China and its war against Japan. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. I don't want to suggest it's just Eurocentrism. There's questions of one has to have the linguistic competency, for example, okay? But I would say that when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we're not just talking about, we're not just talking about social justice. We're not just talking about rectifying underrepresentation. We're talking about doing history well. Because I, for one, went through an undergraduate history program that in many ways was excellent, but it also excluded 4/5 of the human race.
I had to write that down, Graham, so sorry for the delay here. I have a lot of notes of excellent quotes from all of you, so thank you so much. Tanya, do you have anything to add to that? Or
yeah, just very quickly. Firstly, that was a great point there, Graham. I really appreciate that. But I think one of the elements is adapting, as Graham said. Like I like studying the Pacific War from the Commonwealth perspective. And then you can sort of look and say, oh God, those Americans were really stupid. I'll just leave it at that. But what I mean is you can reinterpret things because the American historians only look at American leaders and it'll allow it. But for example, the historiography can improve. So when I think of something like the centenary history of the Royal Canadian Navy, which only has 3 entries about women, mainly dealing with the Second World War, but misses out on that whole chapter of the introduction of women into serving on ships. with HMCS Cormorant, and then the introduction of them getting their watch-keeping tickets and serving on the bridges of ships. This is a huge leap in terms of women being enrolled in the military to free up a man to fight, to women being integrated into militaries and assuming roles alongside the men that are indistinguishable from them. And similarly with the literature of women through military history, that begins to mature, other than just saying, well, there was women in the Navy, Army, Air Force, and there were nurses. We're going beyond that and looking at women doctors, women lab technicians, and so forth. So there's an enrichment that's happening that now when we look back at that traditional body of history, it widens our understanding and perspective, because all of a sudden you realize, well, the hospital is just behind the front, but there were several hundred women there. You know, the Royal Canadian Air Force had women very close to the front in evacuating wounded personnel and so forth. So that gives us a better idea of the reality of the history. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Renee, I'm just going to invite you to add any other perspectives to that if you would like to. Otherwise, we can move on to other questions.
I would only like to emphasize what Graham mentioned about the importance of listening. In a similar way that you can have these World War II histories that aren't talking about anything outside of the US, certainly for the War of 1812, the number of histories where you find absolutely no mention beyond, you know, a reference to Indigenous warriors as this big, vague thing. I mean, what does that even mean? That's all over the place, certainly in my field. And I think that as well as kind of prying open those doors and thinking more specifically about those people, the significance and the importance of listening to those communities and to what interpretations they want to bring, what they have to say about the effect of what we do, as Graham put it, you know, we're all employed, we're privileged, we're all white. These are it makes it easy to not listen. It makes it easy to be comfortable in what you do, be comfortable with what you study and what you publish, and you know, you put it on your CV and away you go. And I think one of the more difficult challenges is the challenge of listening. And I think one of the problems that faces military history is that the people who want to do it, who have this, they're invested in this vision of what it is, this vision of heroism, they are very unwilling to listen. And so it makes the job more difficult, but it also makes it more important that academics do that listening as well. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so many things to think about. And I think somebody mentioned, like, I don't know how to fix that. I think we're teasing out a lot of issues that maybe we're not all going to fix on this live stream today, but it's a lot of food for thought, and I really appreciate it. I do want to really switch gears and ask you all a question that I don't know if we want to talk about this. I'm just going to throw it out there. It's something I've been thinking about in the last few days. And I know Graham made reference to, like, none of us maybe are qualified to talk about current events, but I just want to ask in a very general way, and whoever wants to answer first, if you feel like it, maybe you can just put your hand up. How do you feel that your training as a historian is, in a very broad sense, helping you contextualize current events at large? Or does it help you at all?
I would say I'm less surprised. I mean, I think when I was a teenager, what's happening would have been shocking and terrifying and horrifying. And I find myself not at all surprised. I find myself profoundly disappointed. I find myself using a lot of curse words for particular types of men. But I think I lack the ability to be shocked, if that's a way to think about the way that I've reacted in the past couple of days. It's depressing, but.
Tanya, did you have something to add? It looked like you
yeah, sorry, I was playing with the buttons. Yeah, I think study just highlights the complexity of things that that simple, broad statements really don't help with anything. But alongside with that, there is a life experience element to it. I had about a 16-year gap between doing my undergrad and doing master's level. And I found when it came to examining the literature and talking about the human condition, if you will, just that life experience gave me a certain advantage. At least I perceived it that way over some of the students who were, in their early to mid 20s. So there's that dual aspect to it. But the enormity, the complexity, and it gives, one phrase I've grown really tired of is I've done my research, because it's overused, and I don't think people understand what really constitutes research. You certainly learn in graduate programs what's involved in that and the hard work involved, and it just allows you to say, if you hear something in the news, I've got to dig into that and take a look, and you'll explore different perspectives and try to learn more about it. So thank you.
So Graham, how do you react to that? And you did tell us that you deactivated your Twitter over the weekend because of all of the hot takes that are out there. So I do want to ask you as well, how do you use your training as a historian? Maybe you can't contextualize what's going on, but how do you absorb it?
Yeah, I mean, social media, particularly Twitter, isn't a really great forum for having deep thoughts. I mean, there are some commentators who are really good, who have large followings and have some quality content out there, don't get me wrong. But for the most part, I kind of had the sense, not only over this issue, but over COVID and the recent, I'm going to call it an occupation in Ottawa, that commenting on it on Twitter was a little like shoveling snow during a snowstorm. That was just sort of adding, not actually accomplishing anything, right? Just creating more noise. And this is the exact situation that some early media theorists like Neil Postman warned about, right? That the danger in the future won't be that we lack information, it'll be that there's too much, and that will overwhelm our capacity to reason. And I think we see examples of that. I guess what has history added? Both a sense that things are always complicated, that we really have to be aware of facile remarks about what the lessons of history are. I can't tell you how many times in the last 8-10 days I've heard people say appeasement doesn't work. We proved that at Munich. Okay, no, what was demonstrated at Munich was that negotiations with Hitler failed. That doesn't mean it's applicable to this particular situation. Okay, so that would be a misapplication of a sort of half-learned historical lesson. And so I think maybe what history gives us is the capacity to sort of stop, pause, weigh evidence, understand that things are always complex, as opposed to this kind of facile belief that people have that is somehow you've studied history and therefore you know exactly what to do in the present. Those aren't the types of lessons that history provides us at all. And I guess the final thing I would say is about misapplication of historical analogies, that the present circumstance, while very serious, I don't wish to deny it. I think the historical analogy people should be drawing is Hungary in 1956, not 1914, not 1939. I think that's a more appropriate historical analogy if I was to draw one. But I could be terribly, terribly wrong about that. We'll see.
If anyone else wants to react to what Graham has added to our discussion, I would invite you to do that now. And if not, we can move on from this. I didn't even know how we were going to come into this conversation or how everyone was going to be feeling, but I enjoyed your thoughts on that. And it gives me more things to think about also as a historian. And it's a somber thing that's going on right now. We have no idea what's happening. And that's why it's so important not to really add to the noise. But I do want to lift it up a little bit. And I want to ask the three of you, and again, anyone who wants to maybe jump in first. We just saw 3 fantastic students who are just entering, they're doing their MA studies. I know some of them are planning to do PhDs after this. So we're seeing fantastic historians entering the field. And what I want to ask the 3 of you, and again, whoever wants to jump in first, what's a topic or an angle that you'd love to see a grad student take on? Or more than one. We're giving ideas away for free today.
Well, oh, sorry, go ahead, Tanya. I was just going to
Please,
say,
go ahead, please.
I was just going to say that one area that I think is coming your way, Tanya, is the environmental impacts of war. It's something that I've had very long conversations with my MA students and in my classes that I frankly find very topical and really important. And so for me, that's definitely something I think that is a significant area that needs a lot of work and a lot of careful thought. So for me, that's a very exciting part of new things in the field.
Yeah, I concur. I first came across academic study of the environment from a colleague in the English department, English literature department, who that was their focus when they looked at literature, was how the environment was portrayed. And I know there's been quite a bit of work done on the American Civil War and environment, and that's the models that they create. And I hate models, but the approaches, if you will, towards that. But there's a number of topics I could suggest, but the one thing I encourage anybody wanting to approach a grad topic is to make sure you select something you're interested in, because it's very difficult to work on something that doesn't spark an interest. And that's the important essence, is graduate level work reveals a deeper fascination with historical study than just, oh, I like history. It's a passionate approach towards life. And then determining that whatever they're doing, that they have to focus on giving a new perspective, not just a rehashing of what happened before, not yet another book on the Battle of Lundy's Lane or something like that. Like, what new aspect do you want? And for example, during the bicentenary of the War of 1812, I was quite disappointed with a lot of the literature because it was a rehash of stuff that was already well known. There was some excellent stuff, both at the amateur and professional level, but generally it was very repetitive. So focusing on making an original contribution, I think, is the important element.
All right, Graham, let's hear from you.
So I'll talk about what I'd like to see for the First and Second World War, in particular in Canada, which is my area where I can talk with some authority. We badly need histories of dissenting views in wartime. We've worked so hard in the last 20, 30 years as a community of military historians, if you will, to overcome the lions led by donkeys myth and the excesses of the Paul Fussell and Motorist Exchange view that the war led to this period of cultural despair. And of course, all that's been called into question. But I think the pendulum swung a little too far in that direction. And we're ignoring the fact that there were a lot of dissenting views on the war that deviated from what we might call the veneer of patriotic consensus. And I think that needs to be explored. It's a particularly difficult topic to explore because there were real consequences in wartime, even in Canada, for expressing dissenting views about the war. Legal consequences, I mean. And so just because you go through, say, a journal of poetry and you don't find any dark and cynical poetry about the war, that doesn't mean that people aren't writing it. They're just not submitting it to the journals because they don't want to get into trouble, right? So it's hard to measure dissent, but I'd like to see more of that. And just to give you an example, I'm looking at black markets in Canada during the Second World War right now. I dabbled in that area before. I'm doing more of it right now, because that's a form of dissent, right, from the dominant patriotic norm. That's one thing I'd love to see. And in microhistories of communities, I mean regional communities, but also of groups, focused studies of groups. I think that's very, very important work that we can do right now.
Great, thank you so much to the three of you. I see Chris has just joined us, and Tom. There are two organizers, so before they hop in, I'm going to thank them very sincerely as their committee member for all of the hard work that they've done this weekend in organizing. We had 4 amazing speakers yesterday, and then obviously our 3 panelists today have been so fantastic. Really enjoyed talking to you. I have a lot of notes here. And then our three minute thesis students. So Tom and Chris have put in a ton of work. I'm going to send it back over to them in case they have some questions, and we'll let them wrap it up.
Thanks, Carla-Jean, and thank you to Carla-Jean for such a great job moderating this discussion. Fantastic job there. Good, there's Chris with his camera back on. So I made a note here. So I'm going to scrap my history on the Battle of Lundy's Lane. So it sounds like that's... Thank you so much. Our academic panel and judges, you have donated your time, donated your precious time on a Sunday afternoon, and it's so much appreciated. I do hope we get the chance to see you at a conference somewhere and the infamous networking or cocktail opportunity afterwards, and I'll happily buy you a beverage of your choice. So I do look forward to that opportunity. Would like to thank Chris. I'm glad he's come back on camera. Chris does a lot of the kind of back office admin work, managing our email campaigns, registrations, and coordinating payments and so much more. So, and we have a number of other committee members that give us tremendous license to do what we like doing. So we really appreciate their support and endorsement. We have a wonderful team behind us, all volunteers. We do this with a passion for history and exploring different aspects of history, and really appreciated the answers this afternoon and the comments that will help us frame our thinking about future speakers and topics as well. So Chris, anything to add?
No, I just want to add to Carla-Jean, fantastic work today. I was sort of, Tom and I were texting in the background and saying that was just fantastic work. You actually, on more than one occasion, got some historians to agree on something, which I think is a first in the history of time. So well done.
We curated this panel specifically. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so thank you. And of course, thank you to all our panelists. That was fantastic. And as Tom said, really lots for us to think about. So thank you all for your perspectives.
So I'm going to, I don't know, feels like it's the Olympics or something, declare the games, the conference closed. It's been a fabulous 2 days, really pleased with our audience's support, their participation. It's incredible and helps encourage us to keep doing this and keep going, even when we do get a little bit tired and stumble a little bit. So thank you to our audience, to our speakers, to our 3-minute thesis competitors, and to our panel. Thank you very much. Everyone take care.